Welcome, everyone. It's nice to see so many people on the call. We'll just let everyone trickle in and then get started. Okay. Well, welcome everyone. Hello, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Kristine Johnston, and I'll be facilitating this Maritimes-Guatemala Breaking the Silence, or BTS as I'll refer to it from now on, webinar on the theme of mining resistance. Throughout the webinar, we'll collectively reflect on three main sub-themes. So the various forms mining resistance can take, how mining resistance functions in both Guatemala and in Canada, and our futures within mining resistance work. And I just want to start off by saying I hope that the start to your new years has brought with it a renewed sense of support and motivation to continue this important work together. A little bit about me before we start. I recently completed my master's in criminology at U Ottawa with a focus on corporate crime and impunity within the Canadian extractive industry. And this focus was inspired by my involvement with BTS over the years. My journey with BTS began in 2013 when I traveled to Guatemala as part of a university delegation hosted by BTS on the ground. And on this delegation, I was introduced to BTS's philosophy, solidarity work, and a number of the network's Guatemalan partners, and the rest, as they say, is history. And most of the pictures I've incorporated into the webinar presentation today were actually taken during that delegation, my first introduction to both Guatemala and BTS's work. In terms of housekeeping, I just want to remind folks to be mindful of your video and microphone status as the webinar is being recorded. So just make sure you're using settings that you're comfortable with. And feel free to type any questions, comments, or feedback that you have in the chat, and we'll do our very best to address them throughout the webinar. And if we don't have an answer or response right away, we will make a note and get back to you afterwards. You can also use the chat to interact with other participants and our 4 amazing guest speakers, which I'm really excited about, and I'll introduce them all just in a moment. So to begin, I'd like to engage in a land acknowledgement, knowing how important land is to the many efforts, past, present, and future, to resist colonial capitalist extraction, which includes mining. I would like to acknowledge the Tuscarora and Lumbee peoples whose land I greet you from today. Throughout their histories, the Tuscarora and Lumbee have suffered oppression through loss of land without compensation, exposure to disease, loss of livelihood, racism, slavery, war, and genocide. And as a result of this oppression, many members of the Tuscarora Nation were forced to flee and resettle elsewhere. But both nations have rights to these lands even today and are vibrant nations who continue to live according to their ancestral traditions and offer programs that promote the sustained well-being of their land and people. And at this point, I invite you to please share which territory or territories you're joining from in the chat, where we'll also post some resources that can help you locate them if you may not be aware of which territories those are. And so keeping in mind that acknowledgements are only the beginning, I also urge you to consider how you might take action to learn more about and support Indigenous communities of your region if you're not already doing so. And this is something that I've tried to commit to myself. Before we get into more specific content, we'd also like to know a little bit more about you and why you chose to join us today. So in a few moments, Laura will start a poll that has a few questions, which will hopefully help us do that. So we're looking forward to see the results come in. Awesome. So our first question is, how long have you been involved in mining resistance work? So trying to get a sense of where people are at in their advocacy journeys. And then the second question, are you familiar with BTS's work? So then getting a sense of where, participants, how much participants know about BTS and the work that they do. And then the third question, is what you want to get out of the webinar. So it'll give us a sense of the direction that we should go in tonight. So Looks like we've got a lot of long-time mining resistance work advocates, so that's awesome to see. And some new people who are new to BTS, lots of longtime supporters, and some people who know a little bit. So we've got a good mix on the second question so far. So that's good. It's good to have well-rounded groups. And a good mix on the third question too. So, and hopefully we'll be able to deliver on all three. So we look forward to getting into it. And thanks for participating in the poll. It's always nice to kind of do a little bit of an icebreaker. I know the virtual space isn't always the most ideal, but we're lucky to have you all here. So thanks for participating, and we're excited for what's next. So I'll just go over a bit of a roadmap for what you can expect within the next hour and a half or so. So just one second. Okay, it's a pretty jam-packed schedule with presentations from 4 amazing guest speakers, as I mentioned earlier. But before we hear from them, I will give you a brief overview of BTS and the 3 thematic areas under which the network conducts its work. Then we'll dive a little bit deeper into how defensive territory and mining resistance work interconnect. Following that, we'll hear from our first guest speaker, Karen McKendry, who will talk about her experience with gold mining resistance in Nova Scotia and Mi'kmaq. We'll also hear updates on mining resistance efforts within Guatemala, specifically resistance to the Escobal and Fenix mine projects, including an on-the-ground update from our second guest speaker, Lisa Rankin, who many of you I'm sure know through her work as BTS Director of Guatemala Programs. Then I'll list a few Canadian efforts developed to address and remedy harms associated with the Canadian extractive industry before we hear from our third guest speaker, Emily Dwyer, coordinator of the Canadian Network on Corporate Accountability, who will focus on legislative efforts within Canada, including mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation. After hearing about how various mining resistance efforts function in Nova Scotia, Mi'kmaq, Guatemala, and the broader Canadian and legislative spheres, we'll begin to reflect on the forms those resistance efforts may take. And then, tying each of the previous presentations together, we'll hear from our fourth and final guest speaker, Hannah Martin, who will share personal reflections on her journey as a social justice advocate. Hannah's presentation will lead us into the next portion of the webinar, an interactive activity where we'll create space to build on our learnings and further the discussion together. And finally, we'll finish by presenting concrete actions that you can take to either spark or continue your involvement in mining resistance efforts. So without further ado, we're going to get started. So as stated on BTS's blog, BTS is a voluntary network of people in the Maritimes who began to organize in 1988 to support the efforts of Guatemalans struggling for political, social, and economic justice. It identifies as a grassroots network composed of a community council, steering committee, local committees, thematic committees, and individuals across the country. And in its statement of philosophy, BTS states that injustice is the result of structural inequalities both within and between countries, and it is committed to supporting structural transformation both in Guatemala and in Canada. Moreover, it recognizes the interconnectedness of these two contexts, including the ongoing impacts of colonization on Indigenous communities. And this interconnectedness of the Guatemalan and Canadian context is something we'll continue to discuss throughout this webinar, starting with a brief discussion of how it fits into BTS's work today. Currently, BTS works within the following thematic areas to accompany Guatemalan partner organizations and communities. First, defensive territory, in which BTS supports the rights of Indigenous people regarding access to land and determination over their territories. For example, they do work around ensuring free, prior, and informed consent with respect to Canadian extractive projects, including mining. Second, truth, justice, and impunity, in which BTS supports its Guatemalan partners' quest for justice and an end to impunity for crimes against humanity and crimes of genocide committed during the internal armed conflict. For example, accompaniment of transitional or gender justice cases, like some of the cases that Lisa is currently accompanying in Guatemala City, which I'm sure some of you have heard about through posts on the blog and listserv emails. And finally, human security, in which BTS supports communities in their struggles for and attainment of basic rights for human security, including the right to health, the right to education, work, livelihood, and the right to freedom. And for example, supporting partners' efforts to oppose militarization and criminalization. So where does mining resistance fit? Mining resistance falls within BTS's work around defense of territory. And as BTS notes on its blog, we echo our Guatemalan partners who see the defense of ancestral and indigenous language, culture, historic memory, as well as individual and collective bodies as an important continuation of the defense of territory. So from this perspective, I would echo others' argument that land struggles are human rights struggles, especially considering the extreme oppression facing land and environmental rights protectors, like those opposing the Escobal and Fenix projects located in Guatemala, which are shown on the map. As we know from a Global Witness report released in September 2021, the situation is only getting worse. In this report, 2020 was named the most dangerous year to date for land and environmental defenders, and the climate crisis was highlighted as having an increasingly violent impact on people. From this report and many others like it, we can see that there's an intimate connection between human rights and environmental rights, where protecting the environment often puts human rights at risk. Unfortunately, we don't have to look very far to see this playing out in Indigenous communities in Mi'kma'ki, Guatemala, and other places around the world. Defense of territory in this context, I think, becomes a defense of identity for the many communities whose stories and kin are intimately connected to place. As a settler myself, I think it's important to make these connections, which aren't always intuitive to me, and to unlearn how place has been framed in colonial terms, but to understand it instead in terms of connectedness and relations. Unfortunately, I think we are starting to see some shedding of colonial thought when it comes to advancements in human and environmental rights protections. And so right now, I'd like to take the opportunity to highlight 3 recent developments that I think we can get excited about. The first is Cucamonga Women's Federation versus Petro Peru, a case initiated in Peruvian courts on September 8th, 2021 by the Cucamonga Women's Federation and their lawyers, who filed a legal action to have their river recognized as a legal person. Given the rights afforded to corporations, which have been recognized as legal persons for some time, I think this case is exciting and has important implications for protecting human and environmental rights from within the system, though it's also important to consider the risks that might be inherent to this approach as we move forward. Second, returning to my earlier point that there's an intimate connection between human rights and environmental rights, on October 8th, 2021, the UN Human Rights Council recognized that having a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is a human right, which is a huge win and really important for efforts that we're all involved in. And third, on the decision by Alton to cancel and decommission its natural gas storage project in Nova Scotia Mi'kma'ki, which would have impacted the health of the Shubenacadie River estuary. So even though these 3 cases aren't specifically mining related, they do represent exciting areas of progress in the realm of human and environmental rights defense, which is tied to mining resistance work. So that's why I wanted to highlight them. That Alton, for example, was successfully opposed by grassroots organizers, is something that we can all celebrate as folks engaged in anti-extractive work. Now, each of these initiatives not only adds to the tools we already have, but makes the links between human and environmental rights. They represent new tools at our disposal within struggles for defense of territory. And I attended a webinar recently during which a presenter highlighted the fact that no tool is perfect, but when used together, multiple tools can get a job done well. And when it comes to defending life and territory, I think that the same philosophy can apply, because the more tools we have, the better. More tools mean more opportunities to create spaces of resistance and more opportunities to move forward. And so on that note, I'd like to turn the virtual floor over to our first guest speaker, Karen McKendry, who will talk about her personal experience with gold mining resistance in Nova Scotia, Mi'kma'ki. If you could just please hold questions until the end of Karen's presentation, that would be great. So since moving to Nova Scotia, Mi'kma'ki in 2005, Karen has worked as a conservation biologist and environmental activist. She's tried to influence environmental law and policy at the provincial level with mixed results. She's also no stranger to nonviolent actions to catalyze change of archaic systems and works from both the outside and within existing processes to hinder the advancement of gold mining in Nova Scotia, Mi'kma'ki. So Karen, now the virtual floor is yours. Stop sharing.
Well, thank you, Kristine. Both thank you for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this today. Thank you for grounding us in the territory that we're in. And thanks for setting the stage. I have found that working on gold mining resistance in Nova Scotia, in Mi'kma'ki, that's the range of my experience, causes you to need to find reasons for hope. There's such a long history of disasters and horrific legacy from colonialism, from gold mining that's coming here. We already have a history of impact here. And yeah, so I'll start my presentation off with one little place that gives me hope. I'll share my screen. There we go. So I'll touch on, I'm really just like a tiny pebble in the river of resistance that's been going on in Nova Scotia for a long time, and gold mining is just one of the latest forms of it. This is a place I fight for, and this is a place that gives me hope. This is a picture from the St. Mary's River in Guysborough County. I live in Mi'kma'ki in Jibuktuk area, and so I get up here sometimes and can reconnect with land and water. And it's part of why I'm in this fight, because I learned in 2005 when I moved to Nova Scotia. I was volunteering at the time with a couple organizations, including Ecology Action Center. And these groups were starting a form of resistance, which was responding to a proposed gold mine on the Eastern Shore. At the time, it was called the Moose River Gold Mine. And we engaged in the provincial environmental assessment process and created these excellent documents about why the project, if you delved into the details, there really wasn't a strong rationale for it. It was going to be a very dangerous project for people and the environment. And then the project went ahead. And as a young activist, I was like, well, what the hell? Like, how are we deciding this as a society? How are we going forward in this way? So that was a real blow then. But one of the most sort of nefarious things that I learned at the time is that the company was proposing one mine through the formal environmental assessment process. But I was on an email list for potential investors, and they were talking up 3 more, if not more, gold mines they absolutely plan to build in the future. So this really started to pull back the curtain for me around how corporate capture is happening with our provincial government and how we're being told one thing through one process, and that's not the full story. I also want to highlight, the wreckage from exploitation from gold mining remains in Nova Scotia. Over the last couple hundred years, there have been gold rushes in Nova Scotia, smaller than some of the very famous ones. But they still leave their mark behind, even though they were relatively smaller here. Here's an image of historic gold mining, which used to be done underground, where ore was brought to the surface and it was processed, it was crushed and processed at the time with mercury, which isn't used anymore, and was laced with arsenic, which co-occurs with gold in Nova Scotia. And so we already have more than 60 sites in Nova Scotia that have these historic gold mine tailings that are already contaminated sites. So I find it kind of appalling that we're thinking about purposely building more when we haven't even cleaned up what remains and is still dangerous on the landscape. So this is a picture of the one so far operating open pit gold mine in Nova Scotia. It's in the area that used to have a community called Moose River Gold Mines, but that community was obliterated to make the mine. Many people in Nova Scotia don't even know that gold mining is taking place, what it looks like, its impacts on the landscape. So I think one of the just early forms of resistance here right now is just broader public awareness that this kind of thing is even happening in Nova Scotia. And we should be having a public conversation about, are we willing to sacrifice these areas for these purposes? So we're not even at that level. So I view part of my work is really just awareness building that this is currently happening in Nova Scotia. And it's about to happen, possibly at a much larger scale than even that one horrific mine. excellent activist on the Eastern Shore, Barbara Markovitz, has started to talk about is the Eastern Shore of Nova Scotia a whole sacrificial shore, a zone that has already experienced a lot of degradation, to put it mildly, with wide-scale clear cutting and more. And so this is a map of gold mine claims across the Eastern Shore. So it takes up much of the Eastern Shore. And these are the formally proposed mines right now, but the companies that own these and more would like to see more in the future and are already talking about them to investors. So today I'll give you some specifics of just a couple of these sites, where it says on the left side of your screen, on the western side, the Tuqua deposit, that's the existing gold mine that I showed in the other picture. In the formal environmental assessment process, which I'll speak a little bit about in a moment, there are 3 more sites currently being considered and could be approved in the next couple of years. One is called Beaver Dam, and then moving further to the east, 15-mile stream, and then further up is Cochrane Hill. And these are the names that the company has given to these sites. So to sort of humanize or animalize these sites even more, because they can be kind of abstract in documents and on maps, this is an image from the Beaver Dam area. It wonderfully has beaver dam and beaver in it. It has a lot of water. And so a key thing about these sites and to remember is these would be massive destruction of water. So for those of us who care about water in all of its forms and the various affronts to it, these are fights that at the center of them are large scale destruction of water, wetlands, rivers, streams. And so this is near Crusher Lake, which is a lake that would be degraded by the gold mine beside it. And this site has a proposed gold mine right next to the Killag River, which in Nova Scotia is a river that's had a lot of salmon habitat restoration, an amazing case study in how to restore habitat at a really large scale. It's working and salmon are coming back to the river. The one thing you wouldn't want to do is put a mine right beside it and risk ruining its water chemistry, which has been changed over the last 20 years to facilitate salmon. So wonderfully, one of the forms of resistance that we're seeing here is groups engaging with the environmental assessment system. So digging into those terribly long, very technical documents and finding the errors and finding the inconsistencies and challenging the things the company has just kind of swept over and says are going to be fine. So as part of the environmental assessment for Beaver Dam, which is going through both a federal and provincial assessment, groups like Millbrook First Nation has been ultra clear recently, including in a press release, that they do not want to see this site developed. There is a small but committed group of people called Safe Caribou that have a local tie to the area. They've also come out strongly against this site and the Hall Road that connects several sites. And Nova Scotia Salmon Association has been more strident than ever that there's nothing compatible about what's being proposed and the work that they've been able to do there. 15-mile stream is a site which is in some ways fairly remote and has less personal stories associated with it, but again would be massive destruction of water. Dozens of wetlands would be obliterated. A brook would be redirected to create this mine. And the company arrogantly has said the brook will be better after they re-engineer it. So again, like just a philosophical disregard for the animals and the life and the things that are associated with the site, which would be forever changed after this occurs. But wonderfully, including groups with a provincial scope, have spoken out against this through the environmental assessment process. So Eastern Shore Forest Watch Association has done a deep dive into these really unfairly technical and long documents. East Coast Environmental Law has been doing deep work to respond to these and tie these to climate change commitments provincially and federally that would not be matched by advancing these projects. And Native Council of Nova Scotia has also done really technical work for each of these sites to speak to treaty rights as well as impacts to people and nature and water. And then Cochrane Hill, back on the St. Mary's River, one of my beloved places. Again, really stupid spot for mine. A mine is proposed at the top of the hill, right above this river. This is an incredible river. It is one of the defining characteristics of the communities along the river. It's also had extensive habitat restoration for rare species. There's a lot of protection along the shore. It's one of our gems in Nova Scotia that is full of life and is coming back to life. And it's not where we should change the water chemistry or risk having a giant tailings pond break. So again, people have responded to the very technical documents about this site and found all sorts of problems with them and raised that with government. And St. Mary's River Association has led a really great, interesting campaign called Nope, No Open Pit Excavation with a big unhappy hand, that they've been able to rally a lot of people behind from all over Nova Scotia, because it's just, they're able to show that comparison of this is not where the community wants to go. And provincial scale groups like Nature Nova Scotia are getting involved in defense of wildlife. And one of the only upsides about working on gold mining in Nova Scotia, gold mining resistance, is the wonderful solidarity work and cooperation that happens. So I've always been really pleased since a couple of years ago, Sustainable Northern Nova Scotia really viewed as part of their fight, and they're centered in Tatamagouche area and have their own threat to deal with. They've come to the aid of the St. Mary's River Association and responded to these documents, which is, exhausting and not that interesting, but in solidarity and surely as part of a larger strategy to fight off this wave. And this is the area where Sustainable Northern Nova Scotia is fighting. Theirs is not a specific mine yet, but a whole area that's sort of being proposed to the highest bidder possibly to develop for gold mining, and that would risk impacting the French River watershed, which is the source of water for people in Tatamagouche area. They've used a very clever approach, I think, of trying to apply a set of provincial regulations to protect their water supply. Other groups have also found that to be an excellent approach and are supporting them. They have not heard back from the provincial government on that. So all of these have continuing campaigns to get what they want, to try to protect what's important. And I've just touched on a few. So this is a map of the active mining claims of Nova Scotia. They're not all gold mining claims, but many of them are. There are other projects in various stages of environmental assessment and exploration, including in the Piedmont Valley, the Goldboro project, which is being advanced by Anaconda Mining. And a lot of people don't know, but there are massive areas claimed for gold mine exploration in southwestern Nova Scotia and in Kejimkujik area and beyond. And wonderfully, KMK negotiating office on behalf of the Assembly of Mi'kmaq Chiefs has stated very clearly that they don't want exploration activities to continue in the Pleasantfield area because they risk cultural values and other values in the area. So people in the last couple of years are speaking out more forcefully through formal processes, but there's also wonderfully been other forms of resistance in Nova Scotia, which I find a little more human and interactive than writing documents all weekend. A number of us came together to host a rally in 2019, which seems like a long time ago. The theme of the week was yes to life and no to gold mining. This was on the lawn outside the Alt Hotel at the airport and was in response to a gold mine kind of exhibit and festival being held inside by the gold mining industry in the province, and saying there are people in opposition to this. This was one of the first times we were able to come together in person and say, wow, we're united on this front. So I found it very energizing. And I think you can see Hannah in the front row there, who you'll hear from later. And Hannah has hosted a water walk to respond to damages that are already happening to water, including from gold mining in Nova Scotia. And maybe she'll speak to that a little bit more later. And we have come together, a number of people have come together once for an event called Flowing Together, which Hannah was a co-organizer of in Millbrook First Nation. This included settler people, individuals and groups. And we shared experiences and visions for the future. There was science shared, different organizations' histories was shared. And from that kind of birthed a network that is still going, that's still strategizing and sharing information about how do we fight on these various fronts. So the forms of gold mining resistance I've been involved with so far in Nova Scotia have mostly been interacting through the provincial and federal environmental assessment process. And I think they have been successful in slowing down the advancement of a couple of projects. I don't know that they'll be the thing to stop them because they rarely are, but I think they've slowed them down. And that is a known and effective technique, at least for fighting some mines in Canada. And as we can get together in person more, I think we'll have other forms of resistance that allow more creativity and linking to other related subject matter. What's in the future? A number of us are building a central website about gold mining in Nova Scotia, coming back to that fact that a lot of people don't even know it's happening, that it's already having impacts, and that much more is predicted by these companies and government. So if you want to engage more in this in Nova Scotia, there are many groups working on it, and I'm connected to a number of them. So feel free to get in touch if you are enraged by this and want to engage in it in any way.
Thanks so much, Karen, for your wisdom and for focusing in on hope. I think that's important for a lot of activists who do work that we do, to remember that there is hope and to remember what gives us hope. So thank you for starting your presentation with that and for making us aware of what's happening for a lot of people on the call in our backyards. So I really appreciate you giving us the information and telling us, you know, what can be done and what is happening on the ground right now and where people can go to get more information and to get involved. And stay tuned, because we'll also send everyone a resource package and urgent actions at the after following the webinar. So that'll be coming your way soon. So now that we've had a chance to hear about gold mining resistance in Nova Scotia and Mi'kma'ki, we're going to turn our attention to mining resistance in Guatemala. First, I'll give a brief backgrounder and timeline of the Escobal and Fenix mine projects, and then we'll hear from Lisa Rankin, BTS Director of Guatemala Programs, who will give us an on-the-ground update on BTS partners' resistance to these particular projects. The Escobal mine is the third largest silver mine in the world. It's a Canadian-owned mine located in Xinca territory, about 70 kilometers southeast of Guatemala City. That's changed a number of hands. A number of times throughout its operations. Most notably, it was owned by Tahoe Resources from 2011 to 2019, during which mining and commercial operations were initiated. Tahoe Resources was since acquired by Pan American Silver, the mine's current corporate owner, in 2019. Here are some notable events in the project's timeline that highlight how on-the-ground and legislative resistance efforts intersect and which took place on a legislative scale. So on April 4th, 2013, Guatemala's Ministry of Energy and Mines approved a 25-year mining license, at which point mining operations began. 4 years later, and after much on-the-ground resistance, in May of 2017, legislative efforts to overturn the Escobal mining license were initiated by members of the opposition based on claims that the company breached International Labour Organization Convention 169, or ILO 169, which outlines the rights of Indigenous and tribal peoples and the duties of ratifying states towards them, which includes a duty to consult. 2 months later, in July of 2017, the Guatemalan Supreme Court suspended the Escobal mining license, citing discrimination and lack of consultation with the Xinca, which was in line with claims brought forward against Tahoe Resources at the time. Just over 1 year later, in September of 2018, the Guatemalan Constitutional Court upheld the mine suspension, ordering a consultation be carried out with the Xinca. On October 15th, 2020, Guatemalan authorities finally recognized Xinca representatives elected to participate in the consultation process. And as per the Constitutional Court ruling, a consultation process was announced in April 2021, and the first pre-consultation sessions were held 1 month later. The May consultations were then followed by pre-consultation meetings in August, September, October, and late November of last year, though the entire consultation process has been widely contested by the Xinca. And this particular storyline within the mine's history, I think, provides an example of how grassroots resistance and legislative resistance combine, where affected communities and their allies work together to create change from both within and outside the current system. And we'll talk about the distinction between those two forms a little later in the webinar. And similar efforts have played out in relation to the Fenix mine. So the Fenix mine is an open pit nickel mine, one of the oldest and largest mines in Guatemala. It's located in Ecology territories, about 300 kilometers northeast of Guatemala City. It was opened in the 1960s by Canadian company Inco and passed through Canadian hands until it was sold to the Swiss Russian-based Solway Investment Group in 2011, current owner of the Fenix mine. So here are some notable events in this project's timeline, which reflect the pervasiveness of violence and impunity within capitalist extractive systems, regardless of ownership. So those include that in 1965, Inco was granted a 40-year mining lease where construction and operation of the Fenix mine began. In 1982, the Fenix mine closed due to pricing and politics, but the project was only suspended, not abandoned, and conflicts around land access continued. In December 2004, Canadian company Sky Resources purchased the Fenix mine property from Inco, so you see a change of hands here, the first. 3 years later, a number of forced evictions occurred around Ellis Store in connection with the Fenix project. And during one of those evictions, 11 McKendry women from Lote Ocho were violently sexually assaulted. So you're starting to see a little bit more of the violence that occurred around this mine project. The mine changed hands again in 2008 when Hud Bay Minerals Incorporated purchased Sky Resources, another change of hands. Violence continued, however, under this new Canadian ownership, and on September 27th, 2009, under the command of Minor Padilla, head of mine security, guards shot at peaceful protesters, paralyzing one and killing another. Just over 1 year later, in December 2010, Angelica Kachuk, who I'm sure some of you on the call met during one of BTS's speaking tours, widow of Adolfo H. Chaman, announced that she was suing Hud Bay and its subsidiaries in Canadian courts for the death of her husband. 1 year later, the 11 women from Lote Ocho and German Chukchuk announced that they also intended to sue Hud Bay and its subsidiaries in Canadian courts in 2 separate lawsuits. In September 11, we see another change of hands when Hud Bay sold all of its Guatemalan assets, including the Fenix project, to Solway Investment Group. And then in 2013, a precedent-setting judgment in Ontario courts ruled that all 3 cases could proceed to trial in Canadian courts. This past year, on January 6, 2021, Minor Padilla pled guilty and was finally convicted for the murder of Adolfo H. Chaman in Guatemalan courts. The 3 cases proceeding in Canadian courts, however, are ongoing, and Pan American Silver remains the mine's corporate owner. Solway Investment Group. So as we can see, I think from this storyline, violence and impunity in relation to the Fenix project persisted over time, regardless of corporate ownership and state affiliation. And this is consistent across the extractive industry. While the Fenix mine did change hands from Inco to Sky Resources to Hud Bay Minerals and finally to Solway Investment Group over a span of nearly 50 years, one thing did remain the same. Local communities continued to face violence and oppression as a result of their proximity and opposition to the mine. So with these 2 separate yet intimately connected backgrounds and storylines in mind, we'll now hear from Lisa Rankin for an update on the current situation in Xinca and Kekchi territories. So many of you probably already know Lisa, but just in case there's anyone on the call who doesn't, she traveled to Guatemala as part of a St. FX Immersion Service Learning Delegation in 2008, which inspired her to pursue a career path in human rights. She twice served as a human rights accompanier in Guatemala. And an intern before assuming a staff role. And Lisa's been instrumental in providing inspiration to many BTSers and advocates over her experience in this work. So Lisa, I'll pass the floor to you.
Hi, thanks. Am I off mute here? Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks, Laura. Hi, everyone. My name is Lisa Rankin, and it's lovely to be here with all of you. And yeah, thanks, Kristine, for organizing. And, you know, I think my piece of this presentation is kind of giving an update, although Kristine just did a really great job of doing kind of the history of what's been happening in around the Escobal mine and the Fenix nickel mine. Kristine talked a little bit about BTS's work, and so since 2004, BTS has made support of communities impacted by Canadian mining companies a priority, and so that can look in my day-to-day work, that can change quite frequently, but often it means going to communities, visiting people in their homes. A lot trying to make sure people feel like they're not alone in this struggle, and also doing advocacy work with the Canadian government, Canadian mining companies, and the Guatemalan government. So to kind of, I just did a little presentation because I feel like it's nice to see a few pictures. So this young man has a sign. It was a protest here in Guatemala City that says, "We demand respect." And it's with the legitimate authority of the Xinca people, the Xinca parliament, came to Guatemala City to demand the closure of the Escobal mine. So we heard from Kristine a little bit about who BTS is, and but I just really love this picture. It's a BTS delegation that came to visit the encampments at the Escobal mine in Maritimes-Guatemala, which is one of the really focal points of resistance, the Escobal mine. And that's been a really important part of our work, is making the connections with folks from the north, from Mi'kmaq, with our compañeras in Guatemala. And so making those connections and recognizing our responsibility as Canadians to continue to fight against these companies and support communities. So we're just talking briefly about 2 projects today, but actually there are currently 4 projects that are in levels of suspension or operation, and one that's finished out its lifeline in Guatemala. They're all owned by Canadian companies. We're going to talk a little bit more about Fenix and Escobal, but there's also the Marlin mine, which is now closed, but lived its lifespan. And you can see here, that's a picture on the top of the mine when it was kind of going through its closure process, where it's the open pit is being covered with kind of grass there. And then someone's home cracked from the explosions in the dynamite around that mine. There's also the El Tambor mine, which is, people might know La Puya, which is only 45 minutes outside Guatemala City, currently suspended due to community resistance to that project. And the Cerro Blanco project, which just this week, so some folks I know who are paying lots of attention to Canadian mining in Guatemala wouldn't know this yet, but they just submitted their environmental impact report that was modified to change it from tunnel mining to open pit mining. And this project has the possibility of contaminating the entire water source for El Salvador. This project is right on the border with El Salvador and Guatemala, and it will have devastating impacts. And so instead of having to submit a new environmental impact assessment, which would, they illegally modified it. So they cut out the time when people can oppose that process. It's terrifying. So I think it's just important to mention that. There's also 2 more projects that are coming through right now in Eastern Guatemala, 2 more Canadian projects. So we heard a little bit already from the timeline of the Escobal, or the project Fenix nickel mine in El Estoril, Guatemala. The history of violence around this project goes back from the 1960s, the history of Canadian ownership back to the 1960s. And the case in Canada of Choc versus Hedbay, so the murder of Adolfo Each, the injury to Herman, and the sexual violence committed against the women from Lote Ocho, who are pictured here. That case continues on the ground. It has been a really difficult few months for community resistance to the Fenix nickel mine. The community has been denouncing, especially the Fish Harvesters Guild, for the past few years, denouncing contamination of the Lago Izabal, which the mine is directly located on the edge, the literal edge of this lake. And when the fish harvesters began to denounce this, there was murder by an extrajudicial execution of one of the fish harvesters back in 2017. There was also arrests of vocal opponents, people who had arrest warrants out. And that kind of was happening 2017, 18, 19. And then, in 2020, 21, the community members decided to put it up in an encampment, and for this encampment to stop mining related traffic. And they were met with state repression. They were attacked, and then the government put in a state of siege. So that state of siege began at the end of October of this year. Well, no, last year, 2021. It lasted about a month, and then it was changed to a state of prevention. A state of siege really is likened to martial law, so people's constitutional rights are revoked. And the people were arrested and many people's homes were raided. So the folks who are here in the case against HUD Bay in Canada, their homes were raided, you know, and so you see the connection, although they're, you know, the mine is a different ownership. You know, the folks here are still outspoken opponents to the project. There's no doubt about that, but they're actually haven't been as involved, some of them, in the current, like in the current the encampments, which were more led by the fish harvesters, but of course they're all very, very connected. But people who were outspoken opponents, even in this case that's going forward in Canada, their homes were targeted and raided. And so the state of prevention ended in the end of or beginning of December, sorry, which was the exact state of time when the community consultation was held. And so we know under the International Labor Organization's 169 agreement that they should be free, prior, informed consent. Well, obviously it's not prior. The company has been there since the 1960s. Informed, the government shared little to no information, wouldn't allow the authorities to participate, the legitimate authorities of the Kekchi people. And third, obviously it wasn't free because there was in the middle of a state of siege. And the question that they asked on this community consultation wasn't, do you want the mine or do you not? It was, what are the negative impacts of the project and what can we do to mitigate them? So really, is that an actual consultation about a project or something very, very different? You know, people were repressed, they didn't allow authorities to participate, and really throughout Guatemala, it's a shame. Then, you know, going over to the Escobal mine, you know, it's a very different situation where the Ministry of Energy and Mines has really been forced to kind of take this process in a much more like methodical way, I would say. And so back in 2018, when the Constitutional Court ratified their decision to go forward with a community consultation with the ministry. So it's, the consultation is just between the community, which would be represented by the Xinca Parliament, and the Guatemalan government. So the mine actually has no voice or vote within this consultation process. However, as you can imagine, that is not really in the interest of the project, you know, to be just on the sidelines. So there we have seen instances where, you know, there's been pressure from the company, you know, to try to influence the process, which is really has been really concerning. And so, however, the process is going forward. It's currently in the pre-consultation phase, and we continue to accompany that process to kind of keep our eyes on what's happening in the community. And that this process again isn't prior. The project was in operation since 2013, but that the community is safe and can go forward with this process without threat. You know, it's almost exactly 1 year ago today, one of the community leaders from Maritimes-Guatemala, where that first picture was from, was shot. He inside his home, a vocal opponent to the project, very involved with the resistance movement, and he survived the attack. But, you know, I think it's important to keep that in mind, that, you know, people in both communities are being criminalized, being shot, being attacked, their homes raided for their involvement in these resistances. So we continue to accompany these processes. We continue to go to the Canadian Embassy and demand that they support human rights defenders and hold Guatemalan and Canadian officials and the company responsible. So I think I'll just leave it there. That's my time. And thanks all for coming out, and it's lovely to be here.
Thanks so much, Lisa. It's great to hear what is happening on the ground and what BTS is doing to support communities in opposition to Canadian projects. And I think that you touched really well on like the difference between state and corporation messaging versus what's actually happening on the ground, and how they use different formal processes to deter resistance and to subvert resistance. So thank you for that update, and we look forward to continuing to hear how BTS is supporting communities on the ground. share again here. So far we've heard about resistance efforts in Nova Scotia, Mi'kmaq, and now in BTS partner communities in Guatemala. And so at this point, we're going to switch gears a little bit to discuss resistance efforts on a broader policy and legislation scale. Sometimes, for example, and this was mentioned a few times, international standards like ILO Convention 169 or the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples are used to argue that local communities in opposition to extractive projects like the Escobal and Fenix mines haven't been properly consulted by project owners and managers, and conventions and declarations like these provide a formal base within the existing system to oppose these projects on a legal scale. As well, Canada has attempted several times to improve the way it regulates extractive corporations that are based in Canada but operate abroad. For example, the Government of Canada's 2009 and enhanced 2014 corporate social responsibility frameworks. These frameworks were entirely voluntary, meaning they relied on the good faith of Canadian corporations to adopt and maintain them, which, as many of you know, that doesn't work. So the CSR counselor, which is part of these frameworks, focused on advising stakeholders and reviewing corporate compliance overseas versus investigating and sanctioning. Both frameworks have widely been critiqued for their ineffectiveness and lack of teeth, a phrase I'm sure many of you have used over the years. More recently, Trudeau's Liberal government created the Office of the Canadian Ombudsperson for Responsible Enterprise, or the CORE, which, again, I'm sure many of you on the call were part of advocating for. So the promise position from a 2015 election campaign promise by Trudeau's Liberal government, so this promise was made, in 2015, but the position wasn't created until January 2018. Then it took another year to appoint Sherry Meyerhofer to the position in 2019, and another 2 to open the office for complaints. So as we see, going this way sometimes takes a very long time to then not even get the results that were promised in the beginning. So even though the Liberal government did promise that the CORE would have the power to investigate and compel witness and testimony, it remains a little different from the previous government's CSR counselor. The CORE is neither independent from government, nor does it possess investigatory powers. So as a result, we need to continue to call on the government to empower positions like these and to make sure that they make good on the promises they make to advocates and to people in resistance. So to address and remedy corporate harm, Canadian-based efforts have also focused on making Canadian courts accessible to foreign plaintiffs, like the 3 cases proceeding in Ontario courts currently against Hudbay Minerals, which were brought forward by Guatemalan plaintiffs. But while this is an important step to ensuring victims have access to remedy in Canada, pursuing legal remedy in court is also a very time-consuming and costly avenue for victims. So I think it's important to, yes, open Canadian courts, but have other means available for victims to seek and access remedy. Mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation will hopefully provide that opportunity. The CNCA drafted model legislation, which they called the Corporate Respect for Human Rights and Environmental Abroad Act, which now we'll hear from Emily Dwyer, the coordinator of the Canadian Network on Corporate Accountability, will speak to this legislation and to other legislative efforts in Canada. So Emily Dwyer, coordinator of the CNCA, is here to tell us more, as I said, about legislative efforts designed to address and remedy corporate harm within Canada, like ongoing nationwide campaigns calling on the government to enact mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation. She joined the CNCA as coordinator in August of 2012, and prior to joining the CNCA, she worked as the program officer for Latin America for Lawyers Without Borders Canada, as the coordinator of the Human Rights Accompaniment Program for BTS, and as a human rights accompanier and international observer in Guatemala with the coordination of international accompaniment in Guatemala. She supported BTS campaigns very diligently over the years, and so we're lucky to have Emily on the call tonight. And I'll pass the virtual floor to you now. Thanks for being here.
Thanks very much, Kristine, and nice to see many of you again, and to meet some of you for the first time as well. So I have a PowerPoint too. Hopefully you guys aren't too tired of seeing PowerPoints by now. You're all doing very well at listening to us talk. And hopefully this works out here. So I guess maybe just to say really quickly, I'm just going to try and adjust my screen to make sure the sharing works well. The CNCA, the Breaking the Silence Network, is one of the members of the CNCA. We have 38 member organizations across the country, including international development, faith-based solidarity groups, unions, etc. And one of the things I just wanted to mention quickly in terms of the limitations of the legislation that I'm going to talk about now is that our focus or advocacy orientation is on changing Canadian federal law and policy, which means that the law proposals that we're putting forward focus on the overseas impacts of Canadian companies and not in Canada. And that's not because we don't recognize that there are harms that need to be addressed in Canada as well, or that there are reforms to Canadian law and policy vis-a-vis the Canadian impacts as well. It's simply because when it comes to in Canada impacts, the constitutional division of powers means that those are regulated by the provinces, and so would require different law reforms. I just wanted to make it really clear in terms of what the impacts are of this. We are hopeful that we can be engaging through our member organizations and others to see whether some of the proposals that we have for federal legislation there might be interest in replicating that at the provincial level. But that's not something that we have the capacity to do ourselves. Anyways, just kind of putting that out there. So I'm going to talk primarily about our latest legislative proposal, which is on mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation. And the reason that this law is needed is because of the fact that, as many of you know, companies are essentially able to operate with impunity. And I think that this group is particularly familiar with what's happening in Guatemala, but our membership has partners in every corner of the world, and it's not something, unfortunately, that's unique to Guatemala, but it's actually systematic around the globe. And the way that companies organize their global structures mean that they're able to evade and avoid responsibility even when there are laws or policies that could be enforced against them. So this legislation kind of tries to respond to that reality. So there's three pillars in the law. One, or in the proposed law. One is that it would establish a corporate duty to prevent human rights abuse and environmental damage, so that Canadian companies and companies who are selling goods in Canada would be required to prevent adverse human rights impacts throughout their global operations and supply chains. So they would have to take steps to make sure that they themselves, their subsidiaries, their subcontractors respect human rights and the environment. And the law would apply to companies of all sizes from all sectors. It's expected that there would be regulations that would go alongside this that might exclude some small businesses that work in low-risk sectors. And so that might not seem like a significant thing to say that there's a corporate duty to respect, but right now, what there is simply an expectation for companies to be respecting human rights, but not actually an obligation to do so. The second piece of the legislation is that it would create an obligation to undertake due diligence. So companies would need to develop and implement adequate human rights due diligence procedures, consult with rights holders in their development and implementation, and report on that annually. So that would include things like identifying and assessing adverse impacts, stopping harm that's being caused, and mitigating risks of future harms, monitoring its implementation and the effectiveness of the measures that were taken, creating an alert mechanism to be informed about when there's risks of harms, consulting rights holders, documenting those efforts, and publicly accounting for their actions. Because we know how companies operate, simply having a duty and having a responsibility to undertake due diligence, even if there's a built-in obligation to consult, one of the things that we think is really essential for this kind of law is for there to be strong enforcement. And there's two ways that enforcement is envisioned. One is that it creates a statutory right to file a civil suit in Canada. So one of the things what Kristine was talking earlier about, kind of the length of time that it takes to go through the Canadian court system, and some of the reasons for that are existing barriers to accessing Canadian courts. In the Hud Bay cases, it was years and years and years before the court even determined that they would hear the case. And in all of that time, harm is occurring. So having establishing that people have a right to bring a suit in Canadian court against Canadian companies operating overseas is important. Though that statutory right would apply both if harm occurred and if a company or its subsidiaries of contractor, supplier, etc., isn't taking adequate measures to prevent harm, isn't doing its due diligence. So both as a response to harm that's occurred and as a preventative measure. The second element of enforcement is by the creation of a commissioner that would enforce reporting obligations. And I can get into the whole back and forth about why the role of the commissioner there, but can say that it's primarily to help ensure that those reports are being done annually, and that it's linked to access to courts because there's a defense built into the model law as well, in that a company can seek to avoid a court order against them if they show that they have undertaken effective due diligence measures. And building in that defense, it sounds like it's giving an out to companies, but it's more about shifting the balance of the burden of proof. So the French law that this was kind of modeled after, the duty of vigilance law, required people to establish not only that harm occurred, but also to establish that the harm occurred because due diligence wasn't taken. Our approach was to say it should be enough to show that harm occurred linked to this company's operations. And then the company would have to prove that it did everything possible to avoid that harm. I know I don't have a lot of time, so I just want to kind of jump into a little bit of kind of the context too. I mentioned earlier that the legislation would apply to a broad swath of companies, but also want to mention that it applies to all human rights. So it includes specific reference to the rights of Indigenous peoples, including the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, to labor rights, the rights to a healthy, sustainable environment, etc. And I want to highlight in particular to this group a bit of how we've gotten here, because this is a pretty robust piece of legislation to be saying companies of all sizes need to make sure that they themselves, their subsidiaries, their suppliers and contractors respect all human rights wherever they're operating, have to prevent harm, do due diligence, and can be brought to court. And the reality is that we are able to, oops, that's my alarm saying my time is up, but I'm going to take one more minute if that's okay. The reality is that because of the work that we did together collectively across the country in our Ombudsperson campaign, we've created the space to be able to talk about something, bring forward this proposal that is really comprehensive. Because that campaign, despite the fact that, as Kristine mentioned, the office is not useful as it is right now, the office is not what was promised. There's deep disappointment and concern because impacted communities deserve to have access to remedy now and years ago. But I just want to highlight that work hasn't been for nothing, that the campaign for an effective ombudsperson office has meant that our movement has built knowledge and skills, we've connected with others, we've built power and political space to be able to kind of continue the fight towards corporate accountability in Canada. So just to say, kind of to share that reflection with you and to say thank you. And maybe a little bit later on, we can talk about some of the action possibilities there, but also just to mention that in the lead up to the most recent elections, there were commitments from all of the major parties towards supply chain legislation. And in the mandate letter for the Minister of Labor, there is a commitment towards legislation to deal with forced labor and other human rights abuses. So that impact has come from the letters and calls and movement building and engagement that all of you have done. So thanks so much for the time, and keep on the good fight.
Thanks, Emily. I think that was a really good summation. I know it's hard to summarize such a comprehensive piece of legislation into 10 minutes. So I appreciate you doing that and really kind of teasing out the difference between what's happening right now, which is just an expectation of corporations, and what the legislation is proposing, which is a duty or an obligation. And then also safeguards for that, because even a duty or obligation might not be enough. And so that enforcement capacity and commissioner role, and why that's important. So thanks so much for doing that and condensing it as best you could into 10 minutes. We appreciate you being here and sharing your expertise with us. So now I want to talk a little bit about how I personally sort of tease out the forms of resistance. So we're going to move on to that section of the webinar. And so I attended the launch of Testimonio, a book about crimes of genocide and mining in Guatemala, which I recommend reading. It's a really great read. But during that launch, one of the panelists made a comment that really struck me and stood out and sort of aligned with my own academic work. And they said that the law is a site of struggle, and more than anything, a tool that can be used to create change from within the system, but one that must be coupled with struggles for change from without, like the many on-the-ground struggles we've heard about so far in the webinar. So keeping in mind that we do exist within a capitalist, patriarchal, and colonial system, it's important to consider how our efforts challenge these oppressive structures if we are to create radical, lasting change, since these are based on exploitation, hierarchy, domination, and inequity. And this is what I would categorize as resistance from without, because this type of resistance challenges the current dominant system. But at the same time, engaging in resistance from within the system, like using legislative frameworks that exist, like pressuring governments to enact policies like the one and legislation like mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence, which we heard about from Emily. This can sometimes bring about positive change faster, even though it still takes a long time to get these legislations into action. But whether we use forms of resistance from within or from without, I think our past efforts do give us things that we can build on. They tell us what does or doesn't work in certain situations and how we might move forward. And I've been doing a lot of reflecting myself on how these different forms of resistance play a role in realizing a future that we can all be proud of. And shortly we'll have the opportunity to reflect on this together, and we may be running a little over time. So if you do have to leave right at the end, that's okay, but just hang around for Hannah's presentation, please, before you leave. She's wonderful, and I think really worth a listen. So I look forward in that interactive and reflective portion to hear about how all of you think about and frame resistance in your advocacy journeys. But before we do that, we're going to hear from Hannah. So she's going to share some personal reflections on her social justice advocacy journey. And in doing so, she'll help us make connections between the themes that we've discussed so far. So connections between mining resistance in the global north and the global south, between Guatemalan and Canadian communities, and between resistance from within and from without. So Hannah is a Mi'kmaq woman, basket maker, harvester, and language learner from the Piktuk district, and is a member of Millbrook First Nation. Over the years, she's been a strong advocate for Indigenous rights and believes Indigenous self-determination is tied to the reclamation of ancient knowledge systems. In 2016, she completed an internship at the New Hope Foundation with BTS, following the annual delegation, which broadened her scope of advocacy work to include the experiences of Indigenous peoples on an international scale. So Hannah, I'll turn the floor to you, and we'll hear from you on your experiences. Thanks for being with us.
Walal and Kristine, Walalio. Thank you everyone so much for being here, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak. It's something that I don't find myself doing a whole lot these days, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my journey and what's brought me to this point today. And I know some people will have to leave at 6, so I'm going to start my timer here and try to finish up in 10 minutes, and we can, keep the ball rolling. So my name is Hannah Martin. I am a Mi'kmaq woman from Dahamagooch, or the place where the water is barred by sand, commonly known in English as Tatamagouche. I'm a member of the Millbrook First Nation community, and I recently finished 2 years of work with the Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq. I was there working on building our very first Indigenous land guardian network in Nova Scotia in collaboration with the Unama'ki Institute of Natural Resources and the Mi'kmaq Rights Initiative. This was the first network of its kind in Nova Scotia, and it's called the Nujigelo Dohadajig Earthkeeper Network. And so I recently left my position there, and I'm now going to be working with some various advisory firms, which I'm very excited about. But that's kind of where I'm at now. I want to talk about my involvement with resistance to mining over the past few years, how I got involved, and the different forms that my resistance has taken on. And I'm going to touch on quite a bit and circle back to what Kristine was just speaking about in terms of resistance as Indigenous people on the land. So I very first got involved with Breaking the Silence in 2016. I did a 2-week delegation, and following the delegation, I actually did an additional 10 weeks of an internship at the New Hope Foundation in Rabinal, Guatemala. I actually met Kristine there, as well as Lisa, and I met Catherine for the very first time through this internship. So it was really, really life-changing, the kind of experience that I had there as a Mi'kmaq woman. Not only traveling to Guatemala and traveling to the different partners that we have through Breaking the Silence, and especially, visiting the Marlin mine, where I actually had my very first experience learning about the devastating impacts of gold mines and other kinds of resource mining on Indigenous communities. I also had the opportunity to be at the New Hope Foundation, where truly I had a very life-changing experience learning firsthand from Mayan Indigenous peoples about the ways that they have found resilience and have resisted resource extraction and genocide in their own communities, and the ways that they have continued to not only resist resource extraction, but also reclaim the traditional knowledge that they had to work so hard to hold on to in light of the genocide that their people have faced, I should say the peoples have faced, especially in the Rio Negro area. And so my journey really started there with the work that I've done with advocating for Indigenous rights on an international scale. And this really gave me fuel in my own life with the path that I've taken as a Mi'kmaq woman in light of some of the various issues that we've been facing in Mi'kmaqis, such as the Alton gas extraction project, which was an incredible victory in October when we found out that they were shutting it down. It just felt like so many of us here, I know on this call, and so many who aren't here have just been working so hard. That's just one of the projects that we've been resisting over the years, but it just felt like such an amazing victory for so many of us. And so after my work with Breaking the Silence, I actually changed the direction of my education in university. I was in life sciences, and I actually switched and did my major in Indigenous studies. And through my education in university, I realized how important it was as a Mi'kmaq woman to reclaim my traditions back home. And I did my university degree in McMaster, which is in Hamilton, Ontario, or in the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe territory under the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. So for 4 years, it was really difficult because I was really, really passionate about, you know, mining resistance, Indigenous rights, Indigenous self-determination, reclaiming knowledge, but I felt stuck a little bit because part of me really wanted to do those things back on my own home territory. And I knew that getting my degree was a big goal for myself. So I had to really stick it out and continue on. But through my university education, I began to do more advocacy work for a few different years. I traveled to the United Nations in New York at the headquarters to, the United Nations in New York for the Indigenous Permanent Forum on Indigenous issues. And during that time, did a lot of advocacy work for free, prior, and informed consent in terms of our right as Indigenous peoples around the world to have FPIC when dealing with resource extraction projects. So that was really a focus of my advocacy work. In 2019, I also traveled to Ottawa, where I participated in one of the Daughters of the Boat Forum. And I had the opportunity to speak with the Standing Committee on the Status of Women, and also directly to the Prime Minister to address some of the issues that were spoken about tonight, such as the Canadian Ombudsperson for Responsible Enterprise, and also the ongoing Alton gas project. So at that point, I guess you could say that I was working within the system to try to impact change with the opportunities that I was presented as a very young advocate in this area. And by the end of my degree, I really found that this work was having a major impact on my mental health. And so, you know, and at quite a young age. So at that point, after I moved home and finished at McMaster, I kind of started a new chapter of my journey, which is has been really focusing my life on reclaiming Mi'kmaq knowledge. So when I moved home, I spent about a year working with my grandmother, who was teaching me Mi'kmaq language. In the past couple of years, I began my journey as a Mi'kmaq harvester on the land under the mentorship of my brother. I've also been working with a local organization called Reclaiming Our Roots, which is an organization that was founded by two really brilliant, amazing Mi'kmaq young people, James Doucette and Shanice Hache. And yes, Laura just posted the link in the chat, which is wonderful. And the reason why I bring up Reclaiming Our Roots is because I really think that one of the greatest things that we can continue to do is to support each other in all of our work. And I really think that the work that James and Shanice do, which is focusing on supporting young people in reclaiming traditional Mi'kmaq knowledge, values, worldview, and also skills on the land. And I think really with the resistance to things like mining, I really believe that especially as Indigenous peoples who are so connected to the land, if we can do anything to support young people in strengthening their relationship with the land, reclaiming traditional knowledge, so that they can continue to be stewards on the land, that is also a way that we can work to resist mining in Mi'kmaq and also abroad. And so that's where my journey has really taken me. I've been really focusing on my relationship with the land as a steward, and working with people like James and Shanice to promote this kind of work in Mi'kmaq territory. Over the years, I've also worked with Sustainable Northern Nova Scotia to resist the potential Warwick Mountain mine. I've worked with St. Mary's River Association to protect the St. Mary's River from mining. And I've also worked with many folks in SUNS, as well as the Mi'kmaq grassroots grandmothers to do a water walk in Tatamagouche, which Karen also showed a beautiful picture of. So I just want to maybe end it there. I know I'm almost at my time, but I just wanted to really bring, you know, some of my reflections and my, you know, current position, the current work that I'm doing into the dialogue tonight, just to kind of add that in. And I just want to say again, Walalio, thank you guys so much for coming. Thank you to the other speakers. Thank you to Kristine for organizing this. Yeah, it's been really great to hear the updates, and it's given me a real boost. So thank you guys, and hope everyone has a great night.
Thanks so much, Hannah, for being generous and sharing your story with us. I know that sometimes it can be difficult or vulnerable to share stories, but I think if there's anything that I've learned on the call tonight is that storytelling is very important in terms of making change and educating other people and other folks on the ground resistance and what's going on. And so I think keep sharing stories and keep circling back to the importance of place. I really like that element of your storytelling as well, and your journey, how you went away and then realized that you wanted to be on the land, and the importance of place to you in your journey. So thank you so much for sharing that as well. The value of experiential knowledge and incorporating youth. I think there were a lot of really wonderful tidbits in your story, so, and in your presentation. So thanks again for being with us and for sharing. And thanks to everyone for hanging in there. I know we're at time, but we do have one final activity if people have time to stick around. And so we're going to now offer the opportunity to split off into breakout groups to reflect on some guiding questions, or you could just focus on any takeaways or questions you have coming away from the presentations tonight. Whatever feels right for your groups. And so if you do have the time to stick around, we'll give you about 5 minutes or so, maybe a little bit more, to talk amongst yourselves in small groups. And then we'll come to the main room again and share a little bit on our reflections before presenting you with some calls to action at the end of the webinar. So if you do have time, we'd love to have you stick around, and Laura will arrange some breakout groups right now for folks to join if you do have the time. So thanks again for being here, and we'll see you soon. Sort of what's next. So we have a couple of urgent actions or calls to action that you can engage in, and we will send out information following the webinar to help you engage in these. So the first is to take action to stop gold mining in Nova Scotia and Mi'kmaq, and that involves setting up a meeting with your MLA and urging them to stop gold mining in Nova Scotia and Mi'kmaq. And we have resources for you that will help you do that. resources to find your MLA, and of some information, background, or talking points that you can use in conversation. The second is to help stop mining related corporate abuse overseas in places like Guatemala. So you can engage in the CNCA's mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence campaign by writing, calling, and or engaging with your MP on social media to call on the government to enact this legislation now. Yesterday really would be better. But so doing this will help stop mining related corporate abuse overseas, like in the Xinca and Quechua communities in Guatemala that we heard about on the webinar this evening. And third, you can act in support of some of BTS's Guatemalan partner communities by just sending them messages of support. So we have sample messages and a photo campaign example that you can use to send messages directly to affected communities. And as I mentioned, more information on these 3 actions will be sent out to you via email shortly following the webinar. And so that's it for tonight. And I just wanted to send a huge thank you to the participants that stayed with us and hung in there. We appreciate your time and your participation. And a huge shout out to all the guest speakers for their awesome presentations and sharing their knowledge and expertise with us. And thanks to everyone doing this work. So thanks again. And I hope that you keep engaged and informed and keep acting to stop mining and to resist mining at the hands of Canadian companies and other companies around the world. So have a great rest of your day, wherever it takes you. And just a huge thanks again. I can't say it enough.